When we examine end-time prophecies found in Matthew chapter 24, and we start in verse 3, the disciples came to Jesus and they just point blank asked him a question. They said, and this was a private conversation. He said, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And of course the word age is aion in the Greek language, which literally means age and not world as we know it. But it's just the end of man's age of rule over the earth and the start of God's age, or the ruling of Jesus Christ. In verse 7, let's notice what he says. I've already given the sermon, The Red Horse of the Apocalypse, showing that wars, in verse 6, rumors of wars, and all these things must come to pass. And then in verse 7 it says, for nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. Well, I want to start in the middle of this verse for today's message, the black horse of the apocalypse. And there shall be famines and pestilence and earthquakes in different places. Well, if you've noticed the news lately, especially in the last 3 to 4 years, you'll notice that there has been an increase in earthquake activity all over the earth. But in verse 8, Jesus said, all these are the beginning of sorrows. Now, let's go back and let's review just a little bit. So I've got a few of these earthquake activities and the dates that they occurred so that we can confirm that what Jesus said is true. So here's just a few of them. In October of 1983 in Idaho, there was a 6.9 on the Richter scale earthquake. In Popayan, Colombia, in March of 1983, there was an earthquake of 6.5 on the Richter scale. In Akita, Japan, in May of 1983, there was a 7.7 earthquake on the Richter scale. In El Asnam, which is Algeria, in October of 1980, it was 7.5 on the Richter scale. And then in Coalinga, California, in the United States, in May of 1983, there was an earthquake that registered 6.5 on the Richter scale. Now, there's been various earthquakes all over the earth in addition to these, and I won't quote their particular readings on the Richter scale, but there was one in Guyana, West Africa. In November of 1982, there was one in Belgium. And if you remember, Belgium and Holland, this is the Benelux countries, and that's where one of our members is located. Other large quakes have occurred in Turkey, the Philippines, Hawaiian Islands, and there's been several of them in the United States, including one that could be felt right here in St. Louis, Missouri, a slight tremor. And I looked out and cars were just wiggling all over the parking lot, but they didn't go anywhere, but they just wiggled around a little bit. Well, since 1980, the eruption of Mount St. Helens took place in Washington State. There's been at least 3 other major volcanoes. In Mexico, an entire mountain was literally blown away due to an eruption of a volcano. Now, and as a result of this, a huge cloud of dust has come across the southwest part of the United States, and at least some scientists say, and I don't know how accurate they are, but they say this could be one of a couple of reasons why we've had cooler weather at the beginning of the spring instead of warmer weather. But there's another reason, which I'm going to get into today, as to why it's been cooler and why our weather conditions have been up and down, extreme cold and extreme heat, extreme dry or extreme wet. But now we notice in verse 8 it said, all these are the beginning of sorrows. Now, there's also been volcanic action in the Hawaiian Islands recently. How are all these things beginning to mushroom and come together right at the end of the age, all at the same time? Well, I think there's reasons for it. And we've reported before on what's called the extremely low magnetic frequencies. Now, in Canada, there's a group of scientists led by a Dr. Andrew Makrowski. This man, well, he has the technology available that's provided by the Canadian State Department. And they've established an organization called PACE, P-A-C-E, the Planetary Association for Clean Energy. And they publish a newsletter, and they tell of volcanic activities, weather patterns that's going on all over the world, and how these extremely low frequency magnetic fields are being transmitted from Siberia and Washington, Seattle, Washington in the United States, and the effects that they're having upon weather. Now, the man who actually discovered these extremely low magnetic energy fields is called Nikola Tesla. Now, this man was born in Croatia, which is today Yugoslavia, in July 10th of 1856. And he had extreme abilities in physics and electricity and that type of field. And he was educated in Europe, and then he actually came to the United States. But he worked for an electric company in Paris first, and it was owned by Thomas Edison. Then he came to the United States, and he began to develop AC and DC generators and currents and so on. And he also invented certain transformers and motors. And he worked for Edison here in the United States. Well, he moved here in 1882. And he eventually quit working for Edison because he disagreed with a lot of the things that they were going to put electricity to use for. So in 1889, he became a citizen of the United States, and he started working for George Westinghouse. And he was a very high proponent of AC currency. And this man, George Westinghouse, is the one who financed Tesla and all of his laboratory experiments in New York City. And he developed the generators, the transformers, and certain motors, and he obtained U.S. patents for it. And they're right now in the Patent Office of the United States. And of course, Westinghouse is the one who ended up with most of the usages from these patents which he had. He also wanted to harness the power that comes from the Niagara Falls in New York, which he eventually did. And later on, this particular man moved to Colorado, and he did a great deal of experimenting on magnetic waves and their effects upon the earth and the surface of the earth. And I think this is very important in order to understand what Jesus meant when he said in the end times there's going to come earthquakes, there's going to come, volcanic activity, which is now developing. And it used to be that an earthquake would occur every so often as the crust of the earth shifted. But now, suddenly, they're becoming more frequent. And so on April 18th, 1905, Tesla was issued a United States letter patent. And it was number 787,412. And I want to quote verbatim the title of this patent. And here it is. Stationary waves impressed upon the earth through apparatus for transmission of electrical energy. That's a lot of nonsense to most of us, but what it amounts to is that he has developed and learned the secrets of electricity and transmitting it and creating huge standing waves of electricity that can literally block certain patterns of weather. And he can literally change weather patterns. He can literally create such huge standing waves of extremely low magnetic fields that he can make the whole crust of the earth leap and dance up to 100 feet high. This is what's being developed today. And I want to read just a little bit in this particular patent and what it says. Now, some of this is technical, but we'll boil it down into simple terms eventually. I quote, "The planet behaves like a perfectly smooth or polished conductor of appreciable resistance with capacity and self-induction uniformly distributed along the axis of symmetry of wave propagation and transmitting low electrical oscillations without sensible distortion or attenuation." Now, what does all that mean? It's a lot of nothing to most of us. But what it means is they can create standing waves of electricity. On one side, you have one part of the weather pattern. On another side of this huge standing electrical field, you have another weather pattern. And when this moves across a certain part of the country, you can have warmer air to the south of it, colder air to the north. So all you have to do is shift that weather pattern so that the jet stream will go extremely low in the southern hemisphere or the southern part of the United States. You have nothing, you don't have the jet stream anymore that's going to hold the cold air up into Arctic Canada and the North Pole. So this gush of cold air comes down and invades all the way down to where this jet stream is, all across the United States. So what have you done? You've changed weather patterns. Well, let me turn the page here and I'll go on with this quote. by impressing upon the earth two or more oscillations of different wavelength, a resultant stationary wave may be made to travel slowly over the globe. So here's a huge standing wave of invisible electricity, and it'll move slowly from west to east. That's the way weather patterns go. A resultant stationary wave may be made to travel slowly over the globe, and thus a great variety of useful effects may be produced. You notice he said useful effects. But isn't it true, anytime someone who is a part of Satan's system takes something that could be useful, they always distort it and use it for the evil? It happens every time. If several such generators of stationary waves, preferable of different lengths, so they'll have one of a certain length of waves and another of even longer waves, so that they'll offset each other. He says if of different lengths were installed in selected localities, the entire globe could be subdivided in different zones of electric activity. Now we're going to go on and we're going to see what this means through this black horse of the apocalypse and the portent that it has for the whole human race. Now there's a biography on Tesla called The Prodigal Genius, and it's written by Mr. John J. O'Neill. And he states how Tesla literally set off minor earthquakes from his laboratory in New York, causing the whole neighborhood to just quake, and buildings would shake. And I quote what he says, "Even weak vibrations that are sustained can build up surprisingly large effects when they are absorbed by an object with which they are in resonance." All right, so you have vibrations. And when these vibrations get in perfect harmony with a standing building and the chemical makeup of it and so on, this whole building can just start shaking with it. And this is what happens. And this is how an earthquake is created. And so Tesla would stand in his laboratory, and with all of the inventions that he had, he could just mash a button and start this electrical field and literally start buildings to shake that were further away from him. Well, when you start thinking which small generators he had, and then you start thinking about generators which transmit 4 million watts of electricity, what that can do, or even up into the trillions of watts of electricity, then we can begin to see how these giant moving waves of electrical fields can literally lift the surface of the earth and shift it and create physically. Human beings create earthquakes. Well, we'll get into that in just a second. But Tesla is quoted as saying that his art of, this is what he calls it, telegeodynamics, or transmitting mechanical vibrations through the earth, would make possible the splitting of the earth into two by combining these vibrations which get in resonance with each other. He could literally split up the earth. Now I'll give direct quotes from what he says. "Within a few weeks, I could set the earth's crust into such a state of vibration that it would rise and fall hundreds of feet, throwing whole rivers out of their beds, wrecking buildings, and practically destroying civilization." This is what's already been created by human beings, and it's patented. And here's the thing. The red horse of the apocalypse, the Soviet Union and all of their red allies that are running the world over, has gone into our patent office, and they have lifted these patents, and it's an absolute fact documented by the Canadian government that they are transmitting these huge standing waves right now of electricity from Siberia. And since 1975, and since 1976, all of a sudden, the weather patterns the world over has gone berserk. And this is leading in to the black horse of the apocalypse. I'll go ahead with his quote. "The principle which he's discovered cannot fail. The rhythmical vibrations pass through the earth with almost no loss of energy. It becomes possible to convey mechanical effects to the greatest terrestrial distance." So you can have mechanical effects all the way up into the atmosphere of the earth and produce all kind of unique effects. The invention could be used with destructive effect in war. This is what he says. The scientific knowledge that we're learning today is incredible, and how it's being taken and used against society. Now, there was another biography on Tesla called Lightning in His Hand, the life story of Tesla. I won't give the authors of these, but they went ahead and showed how that he could actually put a small instrument in his pocket in New York City. He would go walking around and he would emit from his pocket these waves, and how a 10-story building was being built right there in New York City, and people were up on these scaffolds surrounding the buildings, and it was just the steel framework. And he created such a force that this building just started shaking, and these men were holding on for dear life, and then suddenly he would turn it off before the building would collapse. This man was walking around doing this from his pocket. So if he can do it from his own pocket in his own laboratory, how many years have we come since the 1920s, 30s, 40s? I mean, we have developed tremendous capability of destroying the earth through extremely low frequency magnetic waves. To be exact, these same waves can be transmitted at 6.66 frequency, and it literally affects the mood of human beings. They can either cause depression or extreme high feelings, just like some drugs. This is a scientific fact. Well, Tesla died on January 7th, 1943. But very soon after that, the communist government of Yugoslavia confiscated all of his papers. And a museum was set up in his honor in Belgrade, and it's there till this day. So the Russians definitely are using his inventions to their advantage. In an interview, an article published in the November 14th, 1977 Vancouver Province, Dr. Makrowski, which I mentioned to start with, said that when the Soviets began to work on a large scale with Tesla's technology, they lost control of their giant standing waves in the spring of 1977. Now, in May of 1977, the USSR, or Russia, went to great lengths or effects to try to break down this huge electrical waves that they'd created, but they failed. But before they could actually destroy them, which took a period of time, these waves, according to Makrowski, collided in 3 different points late in June of that year. And each time these waves would collide with each other and cross, it created a major earthquake somewhere in the world. Each time, he said. He said that in January 1978, in a research paper that he entitled Global Magnetic Warfare, and I quote, that of the many great earthquakes of 1976, there is one that demands special attention. And I think this should stand all of our hair on ends. I'll continue. The July 28, 1976 Tangshan, China earthquake. The reason that this earthquake attracted my attention is that it was preceded by a light flare-up on the entire sky over Tangshan. Also, this earthquake occurred during the first month of the Soviet radio wave transmissions. The most prominent effect was that when the Soviet emissions were at full strength, the Canadian observers would always see the sky light up like an ionized gas lamp, just as Tesla predicted in his testing. So what happens is, as these huge columnar walls of electricity moves across the sky, it has lights at the top because it ionizes the upper atmosphere. And so what have we been seeing in recent years? More UFO sightings. They always see bright lights that appear suddenly and then disappear. And this is the ionization of the atmosphere as this huge electrical flow or current comes across. And then this is exactly what happened before this great earthquake that killed 650,000 people in China in 1976. Well, let's go on. In June 5th of 1977, the New York Times carried a description of that earthquake on July 28th, 1976 in China. And they said it killed over 650,000 people. And now here's a direct quote. Just before the first tremor at 3:42 a.m., the sky lit up like daylight. The multi-hued lights, mostly white and red, were seen up to 200 miles away. Leaves on many trees were burned to a crisp, and growing vegetables were scorched on one side, as if by a fireball. This is exactly the description that Tesla gave in his patented work that's in the patent office right now. Now, the Soviet Union and the United States both have been transmitting extremely low frequencies since 1980, both of them at the same time. And there's been a sharp increase since 1980 in earthquakes all around the world. Now, on January 30th, 1981, this is what the Washington Post reported. I quote, "The world sustained 71 significant earthquakes during 1980, up from 56 the previous year. And the world death toll climbed to 7,140, 5 times the 1979 figure," the U.S. Geological Survey said. Well, the Soviets have their transmitter located in Angorsk, Siberia. And they send out these waves all across the North American western coast. Now, in a supplement number 4 to the application of Tesla's technology in today's world, this was issued October 15th, 1980, I'll quote, "The American extremely low frequency transmitter is located in the extreme northwest portion of the United States in the near vicinity of U.S. Navy base at Seattle. The magnetic waves that accompany these radio transmissions have some striking similarities to naturally occurring geomagnetic waves that have a fundamental frequency resonating at 7.83 hertz. So I know this is a little technical, but what I'm getting to is there is developments now that are man-made because we're altering and tampering with the laws of God and using these forces for evil rather than good. And as a direct result, we are bringing on the apocalypse upon ourselves. We're doing it to ourselves. Now, one of the agencies, I'll go ahead and quote this, one of the agencies in the worldwide network monitoring these signals is the Pacific Northwest Center for Non-Ionizing Radiation. He says, since June of 1979, they have detected variable pulse width magnetic waves of 10, 15, and 30 hertz. I realize this doesn't mean a thing to us who are not magnetically minded, but he says the United States transmissions, due to their extreme magnetic intensity and sophistication, are several hundred times the planet's natural magnetic field intensity. So our natural magnetic field and the ones we're transmitting is several hundred times greater. Therefore, it's going to have an effect upon the Earth's crust and surface. Well, this produces, they say, huge vertically oriented standing waves across the whole Pacific coast of the United States. And as a direct result, it has caused earthquakes. And I want to get into just a few of the things that it has done to the weather. There was a NOVA series. This was on National Public Television, the broadcasting system. They ran an hour-long television documentary. And here's what it's called, The Anatomy of a Volcano. Since these huge standing waves have been circling the globe of electromagnetic, extremely low frequency, they say that a major part of the earthquake that occurred, Mount St. Helens, was due directly to these standing waves. Now, I'll quote, "As a seismometer in a Seattle basement decisively twitched on March 20th, 1980, 123 years of inactivity inside Mount St. Helens was coming to an end. That opening note of the overture was echoed by station after station reporting the arrival of a substantial earthquake." And he goes on to show in this particular report that this was the most unusual volcano that has ever occurred. And what's important is that Mount St. Helens remained quiet for 123 years and only became active after regular Soviet emissions of these extremely low frequency waves, and the United States began to emit them at the same time. So I'll go on now with this NOVA documentary. Quote, "What finally triggered the big eruption was a magnitude 5 earthquake." So there was an earthquake which actually set off the volcano. And what is interesting is they went on to show that there was a huge moving magnetic wave that crossed Mount St. Helens and helped to set off this earthquake that in turn set off the volcano. And they went on to show that this was a literal earthquake-induced volcano. And it was the first lateral eruption in history. Now what does that mean? Usually a volcano will erupt out the top. But this one blew out the side, blew out the whole side of a mountain. And it was due to this extremely low frequency magnetic waves. NOVA went on to say, and I'll quote, "With the restraining weight of the north face slope no longer there, the mountain uncorked and the avalanche was rapidly overtaken by a black cloud that blasted sideways." And so this huge magnitude of the wave that came across, this huge standing wave, created the earthquake. It in turn created the volcanic activity, and it literally exploded out the side of the mountain. And it laid waste in a 200 square mile area of nothing but dust, rock, and ash that's left there today as a direct result. All this, he says, or Jesus said, is only the beginning of sorrows. See, it's only the beginning. And now there's 2 of these transmitters that is putting out, and the one in Russia is capable of putting out, now get this, because this, we think of a 50,000 watt radio station as a powerful station. Signals go up to 2,000 miles on a clear night. They can put out up to 4 trillion watts of electrical power. 4 trillion. That is incredible. We can't even conceive what that is. But this Dr. Makrowski, in a newsletter in February 1978, he went on to show how these giant standing waves are literally changing weather patterns. And I quote, "In the case of the winter in 1976-77, that was the first one where we had all the snow that stayed on the ground 2 feet deep for 60 days. The Soviets have managed to establish terrestrial electric resonance and then to learn how to establish relatively stable and localized extremely low frequency magnetic fields, which were able to hamper or divert the jet stream flow in the northern hemisphere." So they stood these huge magnetic walls of electricity, invisible to the human eye, but you take a picture from satellite showing the weather. Here comes the jet stream. All of a sudden it hits this huge standing wall of electromagnetic frequencies, and it diverts the jet stream to the south of it. And so the jet stream went across Arizona, lower Texas, and the Gulf Coast. And so all of this cold air just came flooding in from the north. This is exactly what he described in his paper that he puts out. And November 16th of 1980, the Washington Post magazine carried a very important article by Mr. Bob Ryan. And this man is he holds a meteorology degree from New York State University. And he said, and I quote, "The summer of 1980 was the hottest ever recorded in Washington, D.C. The jet stream, a river of high-speed air about 8 miles above us, has been up to some wild antics the past few years. And it only started being realized after these extremely low frequency magnetic waves have been created. The jet stream occurs at the boundary of the 2 great air masses that govern our weather in the northern latitudes." So here's the jet stream. Below it is the warmer, more moist air. Above it is the drier, cold air. The cold polar air expands and contracts at the season's progress, and the jet stream at its southern boundary migrates south or north. So as summer comes on, the jet stream goes further north and allows the heat and the warm air to come up. But as winter comes on, the jet stream goes further south and allows colder air to come. So the greater temperature contrast from north to south, the greater the amplitude of the undulations of the jet stream. So according to the jet stream, that's according to our weather for that year. And with these huge standing waves diverting the jet stream either extremely north, it creates hot weather, extreme dry weather, and famine. Or they can divert it north and create extremely cold weather and literally change the average temperature from 3 to 5 degrees. And he says, and I'll end the quote with this, as a result, there has been a tremendous contrast in weather and extremes in weather. Well, this is just something for us to be watching, these particular reports, because I believe with all of my heart that man is the one, just like man is taking peace from the earth, so it is that man is going to see to it that the black horse of the apocalypse goes out. Well, let's go on from here now. Let's note now in verse 7 here that it did say earthquakes in different places, but being accompanied with the earthquakes, we're going to have famines and pestilence. Well, let's go and see if we can't investigate just a little bit. Now, as we realize, when famine does take place, when famines come, how do they come? Well, first of all, weather affects famines. And as we can see, the jet streams can be pushed north or south to create either famine, extreme cold weather, dry weather. They can affect any type of weather they want by diverting the jet stream. Now, let's go to Revelation chapter 1. Revelation chapter 1 and see what the end time book says. In Revelation 1, verse 1, this gives the time setting, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave unto him to show unto his servants things which must shortly come to pass. Now, the phrase shortly come to pass in the Greek language means when you reach a certain time, a place in time, then suddenly these events are going to start occurring in a rapid succession. So this is what the book of Revelation is all about. Verse 10 is the time setting. I was in the Spirit, and the word on in the King James Version comes from the Greek word en. It can be translated by, at, on, or in. Now the King James translators put on because they believe Sunday was the Lord's Day, because the Roman Empire decreed it as the Lord's Day. But the actual translation should have been in or into. I was in the Spirit in the Lord's Day, the very end of the age, the very time preceding the return of Jesus Christ. And it shows that all the way through this book. Now, let's go to chapter 6. Because chapter 6 is when the seals are opened up. The first seal in verse 2 and 3, verse 1, 2, and 3 was the white horse. Or verse 3, the second seal was the red horse, which is taking peace from the earth today and conquering. Then in verse 5, and when he had opened the third seal, I heard the third beast say, Come and see. And I beheld, and lo, a black horse. And he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hands. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four beasts saying, A measure of wheat for a penny, and three measures of barley for a penny, and see that you hurt not the oil or the wine. So something to do with transacting business here and buying food, growing food and having a sufficient amount, because you make sure you don't overuse it, you don't waste it. And what could that be other than famine coming on as a direct result of us altering the weather conditions that control planet Earth? And as a direct result, famine. Just like Jesus said, accompanying earthquakes in different places would be famines. And so here it is that the black horse is going to ride, and he's going to have balances in his hand, and he's going to balance just a money for a little bit of food here and there. And you can only do that when there is no food available, and when weather conditions have been such that suddenly no crops can be grown. Now there's several factors that does this. Either it becomes too hot, too cold, too wet, or too dry. All these factors affect food production. Famine results when there's not enough food. But there's also another factor, a factor that directly comes right along behind the second horse. When you're taking peace from the earth, what happens? You have people uprooted from their land. They can't plant crops to grow food for their own survival. Therefore, they become vagabonds traveling and going to these camps that we see in Africa and different places, India, where the people are uprooted due to revolutionary war from taking peace from the earth. So since there's no stable crop production in those areas, people don't have food, so they begin to die and starve to death. There was an article by a Mr. N.W. Hutchins entitled End Time Weather. I want to quote extensively from that particular article. Quote, "The Earth's ecology, which makes life possible on this planet, is delicately balanced. According to often quoted scientific sources, the rise or fall of average temperatures of 3 degrees will either bring on an ice age or melt ice caps, causing floods and inundating entire islands." So it would cause whole islands to submerge under the runoff of this water supply, and reducing continental land masses, such as you've heard of predictions that one day it's going to become hot, the North Pole will melt, and New York City and California will go underwater. Well, this is what he says, the possibility. Now, on May 11th, 1976, the St. Paul Dispatch reported, and I quote, "No nation anywhere in the world, especially in Russia, China, India, and the United States, can afford to take lightly the omnibus century weather forecast covering the entire planet, prepared for the Central Intelligence Agency." Nobody can ignore this forecast. Here we go. "It is a calmly chilling and scholarly meteorological study pointing to radical changes in the climate as to cause its authors to warn that the consequence in political and economic upheaval and international violence will be almost beyond human comprehension." All is a direct result of these of modifying the weather through extremely low frequency, magnetic frequencies, and these huge waves that they can manipulate the weather. We are now in weather warfare with the Soviet Union. I'll go on. The CIA may have misjudged the oncoming 1973 Yom Kippur War in the Middle East, so they didn't realize there was going to be a Yom Kippur War. But it would be perilous to assume that its report is misjudging the oncoming weather that every continent will be experiencing during the rest of the 20th century. So they're saying, you better listen to this. You may not have realized there was going to be an invasion of Israel in the Middle East on the Day of Atonement when Israel was supposed to be fasting. But you better not misjudge the weather report that's been prepared for the rest of the century. It's imperative as human survival without such frustration and fear that war becomes inevitable. Why? Because of massive starvation and death due to the weather. Right now, we're producing on a global basis exactly enough food if we redistributed it from the United States so everybody could have 3 cups of grain a day. That's at present population and present production of food. Let's go on with this quote. "Over the vast areas of the land mass, or the Earth's land mass, that even now cannot produce enough food to produce or to feed all mankind, the signs now accumulating point to these forecasts." So all of their data saying population, the amount of land available to grow food, the weather changes due to these, the weather war between the United States and Canada, this is their portent. There will be destructive droughts where droughts have not been occurring. The climatic changes that have taken place during the past 5 years can, and this is what the experts are saying, bring consequences such as the following. The Soviet Union would lose the lush wheat fields of the entire Kazakhstan area, like the Middle East, wheat fields of Kansas, Nebraska, North and South Dakota. they would lose their entire wheat production. China would experience a major famine. Droughts would grip India, resulting in starvation of 150 million people. Does this sound like the black horse of the apocalypse, where there's not food production enough to feed everybody on earth, and they're saying, oh, take care of that. Don't hurt the oil. Don't hurt the wine. Take care of that wheat. Don't let not one kernel fall to the ground. We have to have it for food. They went on to say that Europe's food exports to other countries would drop to zero. The United States would be the least affected. But with food shortages stalking the rest of the world, the United States would provide only marginal and very selective assistance to other countries. Well, the Global 2000 report put out by the Club of Rome, which I've mentioned so many times, said that 2 billion people had to be eliminated by the year 2000. No wonder those people who are in control of the extremely low frequency magnetic waves that is creating global weather war, no wonder they're using this, because they believe they must lower the population from 4.5 billion to 2.5 billion so the earth could sustain such a population. They control these generators. They're the ones who are trying to create a one world government. Let's go just a little further and see how this could affect this black horse of the apocalypse could be riding the earth. The sea constitutes approximately, according to scientists, 3/4 of the earth's surface. And that the seas have to be ecologically balanced, because we have a great deal of oxygen that supplies us, our oxygen that comes from the ocean. And they said that the ocean actually controls a great deal of the weather patterns that prevail on the mainlands. Now, evidence has been accumulating that these worldwide weather patterns that are being changed are affecting the oceans. There was an article that appeared in the August 17th, 1983 edition of the Los Angeles Times, and this was entitled El Nino. El Nino. This was published by Oregon State University, an oceanographer there, Mr. William Quinn. And he said that the ocean natural catastrophe is being unequaled in this century in the oceans. He said that all this natural catastrophe is being associated with the warm ocean currents that he calls El Nino. And in the past couple of years, this disrupted weather pattern has literally created havoc across 3/4 of the globe. Now, he gave examples of the catastrophic weather changes that are going on all over the globe. He said that Peru and Bolivia was gripped in a drought that resulted in $250 million worth of losses to their agriculture. While in Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay, there was floods that killed 170 people and disrupted 600,000 homes, and people had to be evacuated. And this resulted in damages of over $3 billion. This was just in the last couple of years. He went on to show the drastic weather changes that were happening globally. He said, he quoted from the Los Angeles Times, in desert areas of Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia, where the climate is normally very arid, there's not much rainfall, over 12 feet of rain fell in just a short period of time, when the normal for the entire year is only 4 to 5 inches. This is all a direct result of this altering of the weather in the world today. And he said, of course, the roofs of these mud huts that they live in just fell in under the deluge of 12 feet of water. Well, he went on and he said that agricultural regions north of Bolivia and South Peru had been laid wasted by 8 straight months of rain, which is unheard of. Roads on the Pan American Highway all the way through South America, he said they ended in lakes and you couldn't even travel on them. And he said that some 40,000 adobe homes had just melted under all the water that had been going on. And he saw that in one place in South America, where there's usually no rainfall, hardly at all, he saw as much rainfall in 1 6-week period as they usually get in 6 solid years. This is happening due to our altering the weather. And as a direct result, your crops can't grow because of too much water, or else famine occurs and there's no crop production there. And this is what's happening. And we're doing it to ourselves, all because of those who are behind the satanic conspiracy for world government want to reduce the population. But now, what about on the other side of the Pacific Ocean? Not just the United States and South America. Australia has just now ended the driest summer in 200 years. Crop and livestock and property damage reached over $3 billion in Australia. In 19 different African countries, they endured the greatest property and crop damage, over $1.2 billion. Cattle, sheep, and goats had died by the thousands. In Zimbabwe, now that's modern day, or used to be, Rhodesia, when Ian Smith was and it was a part of the British Commonwealth. They faced the need to relocate over 1 million head of cattle due to drought, no rain. Micronesia was running out of drinking water, and they were facing serious health problems, including an outbreak of infectious hepatitis. Now, what always happens on the heel of the lack of food? The body weakens, disease epidemics come along. Why is it? I just wonder why our health department of the United States now are saying it's not necessary to immunize children anymore. I wonder if, with all of this planned destruction and the reduction of over 2 billion people, that a part of it is not going to be weaken the body through famine and then allow disease epidemics to run rampant on the earth once again. I just wonder about that, and I just thought I'd throw that in. But between January and June of this year, or I guess it's 1983, certain parts of the Orient, Yap and Panape, which usually get about 180, 110 inches of rain, had only 7 inches. 7 inches in a 6-month period. Indonesia had over 340 deaths and $600 million in crop damage. And the story goes on and on and on. So we can see this is not just an isolated incident, but it has become a global problem. And that's the point that I'm mentioning. Now, turn to Joel in the Old Testament in one of the prophecies. Joel chapter 1. Joel chapter 1, starting in verse 1. The word of the Lord that came to Joel, and here's what he's going to say. Verse 2, had this been in your days, or even in the days of your father, and then on down in verse 4, it starts talking about famine, and you can see it very clearly where the palmer worm is going to come along and what the locust hadn't eaten, and the cankerworm will, and the caterpillar will come right behind that. Then down in verse 4 or 7, he has laid my vine waste. This is food production, crop production. It's laid waste, and barked my fig tree. So they stripped the fig trees even of the bark. He hath made it clean bare and cast it away. The branches are made white. So the trees are even going to be stripped clean. Then in verse 10, the field is wasted, the land mourns, for the corn is wasted. The new vine is dried up, the oil languishes. Howl, ye husbandmen, howl, O you vine dressers, for the wheat and for the barley, because the harvest of the field is perished. And when you get the time setting of this, and that's what I'm leading into, we're going to see that this is the same thing as the black horse of the apocalypse. Because you see in verse 12, the vine is dried up, the fig tree languishes, nothing is growing and producing. Verse 15, alas for the day of the Lord is at hand. The end of the age. The book of Revelation here in Joel go hand in glove. And it says there's going to be famine. And you read on down through the next few verses. Verse 17, the seed is rotten. So it's famine all over again. Verse 18, the beast groaned because of the weather conditions that we're producing ourselves through these extremely low magnetic fields that is circling the globe. And Hosea chapter 5, verse 9, reads like this. Ephraim, and this is directly talking about the twin sons of Joseph. Ephraim shall be desolate in the day of rebuke. Among the tribes of Israel have I made known that which shall surely be. So God is going to make known through radio broadcasting, telecasting, maybe magazines, literature, what is going to happen to Israel today. Now, Revelation chapter 6, once again. Revelation chapter 6. So God is going to warn modern-day Israel as to what's going to happen. Now, in verse 7, and when he had opened the fourth seal, so here is another seal. What did he see? A pale horse. Now, what's going to follow? Famine and the weakening of the body and our systems in our body. Death and hell followed with him. And power was given unto them over the fourth part of the earth to kill, what with? The sword. Why? Because there's going to be food wars. When you have food and someone else doesn't, they're going to come try to take it for sheer survival. And with hunger, famine, and with death, and with the beast of the field, or beast of the earth. So the fourth horse of the apocalypse, the pale horse, is going to come right behind the third one, where there's going to be famine sweeping the earth, and then disease epidemics. All of this is, one's going to lead right into the other, so that you won't see where one ends and the other begins, because it's all going to be mixed in together. As the red horse continues to uproot people and whole civilizations, and they conquer the earth, then the extremely low frequency magnetic waves are going to cause upset weather conditions, famines, all at the same time. Then it's going to be followed with death from pestilence and disease epidemics. All of this is the beginning of sorrows, and we haven't hit this part yet. I believe now we're only entering into this period of time where it's called the beginning of sorrows. Verse 9 to 11. And once this beginning of sorrows starts, and when he had opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altars the souls of them that were slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. There's going to be a martyrdom of saints. And why in the world would this happen? Could it be that those who are working for world government believe that the Christian religion, they would use it as a scapegoat to blame all of the world's problems on Christians? And therefore they would say, let's eliminate the problem, Christians. And then suddenly this martyrdom starts. Then the sixth seal in verse 12 was opened. Great earthquakes, the sun, this is the heavenly signs and so on. Showing in verse 17, for the great day of his wrath, Christ's wrath, is going to come eventually. And now all of a sudden we come to chapter 7. Now this was a chapter that I mentioned on Pentecost. And I didn't know where it fit, but I do now. I do now, and I want to bring it to you today because all of these things are going to be happening. You and I are going to be a part of this. Chapter 7, the first 8 verses shows very clearly there's going to be 144,000 people who are going to be sealed with the living God. And the word seal means to protect them. It's going to be, you are sealed as in secret, as if God built a hedge around you, and the rest of the world didn't even know you were there. Now, look what he says in verse 3 of Revelation 7. He says, saying, hurt not the earth, neither the sea nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads. So there's all of these happenings, nuclear warfare that's going to be raging in chapter 9 will not happen until God has sealed and preserved as in secret this 144,000. And according to Revelation 14, verses 1 to 4, it's going to be those who are following Jesus every step of the way. Everything this book says, when they discover it, they're going to get in harmony with it. This is divine protection for a certain group of people. But then, verse 9 through the rest of the chapter is another group who claim the name of Jesus, but they have not overcome and they're not willing to follow him everywhere he goes. And they're going to go through the tribulation without divine protection, but they will wash their robes white and go into the kingdom of God at the exact same time this 144,000 will. Now let's turn to Revelation chapter 8 verse 1. You'll see the seventh seal is open. There's only 7 seals. The seventh seal then is composed of 7 trumpets. Now look over in chapter 9. All of a sudden here is verse 1, the 5th trumpet sounds. Remember, Jesus is going to return at the 7th trump. Hear the fifth trumpet sounds. Look in verse 4 now. And it was commanded them that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, nor any green thing, nor any tree. Isn't that the exact same thing that we're saying in chapter 7? They would set a seal on the 144,000, and they weren't to hurt anything until that sealing was done. Now all of a sudden, in verse 4, these angels were to let all hell break loose. And look what he says, who they were to hurt. They were only to hurt those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads. So here the people with the seal are still on earth, but they're not going to be hurt. Everybody else can be hurt by the events that are going to follow in chapter 9, which we see is, without a doubt, going to be nuclear warfare. Because it says in verse 15, it's going to, the very last phrase, it's going to slay the third part of men with fire, brimstone, and smoke. And when you look in Genesis chapter, where is it? Chapter 18, verse 24 to 26 in there, where Sodom and Gomorrah were totally obliterated by God, that everything was disintegrated. There wasn't a building left, a person left. It can only be nuclear war, which can literally atomize everything and turn it back to the elements which are invisible to the human eye. Well, all of this is going to happen, but there's going to be a sealing first. And then all of this destruction is going to occur. And then all of a sudden, chapter 13, there's going to be a beast, this world government rise. And it's prophesied. And in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, when all of this destruction occurs, the four horses of the apocalypse run over the earth, then this global warfare occurs. What's going to happen? A fourth of the population of the earth died from famine. So that means there's only 3 billion left. And then another third of those die from war. That means there's only going to be 2 billion left. What did those people in the Club of Rome say? They wanted to reduce the population in half by the year 2000. And once all of this has happened, these nuclear wars, devastation, radiation, the reduction of the population, they're going to say the only hope left for man is world government. And a beast is going to rise out of the sea, and the world government will start. But look what Jesus says in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 2 and 3. For yourselves, Christians, know perfectly that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. For when they, not Christians, the rest of the world says peace and safety, look, world government to keep us from destroying ourselves, then sudden destruction comes upon them, and they'll not escape. Because Jesus is going to return. And when Jesus does return, let's turn to 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 8. Because all Christians definitely are going to be resurrected at the same time, even that 144,000 that receive special protection. Start in verse 6 to 8. For I, Paul, am now ready to be offered, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought a good fight, I have finished my course, I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day. And not only to me, but unto all them that love his appearing. All is all-inclusive. All people, even the 144,000, they will definitely be resurrected at this time. And then in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, I just want to mention a couple of these things to ensure us and to give us hope that even though these things are coming, we can, number one, if we'll follow the Lamb, have divine protection through this. Others won't, but we could if we meet the qualifications. And only Jesus knows. Only Him. And none of us know. But we can do everything we can by living by this book through the power of God's Holy Spirit. 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 13. But I would not have you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning them that are asleep, that you sorrow not even as others who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so them which sleep in Jesus will God bring with Him. For this we say unto you by the word of the Lord, that we which are alive, at least we know 144,000 are going to be protected out of the reach of the serpent. Revelation 12, 13 to 17 says so. And it says the earth nourished the woman. What is nourishment? It's feeding, keeping the body alive. We which are alive and remain unto the coming of the Lord shall not prevent, and the Greek word is precede, them which are asleep. For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, with the trump. And it's the seventh trump. Revelation 7 or 11, verse 15 to 18. And the dead in Christ shall rise. Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds. And then we'll ever be with the Lord. And that confirms Revelation 20, verse 4 to 6, where it does specifically say this will be the first resurrection. So what I'm saying in all of these sermons I've been giving is that the four horsemen of the apocalypse are going to ravage the earth. We're doing it to ourselves through warfare, through induced weather conditions that's going to create famine, through pestilence, disease epidemics following behind it. And then the heavenly signs are going to come. And then the trumpets are going to be blown. And when those trumpets are blowing, God is going to set a seal on certain people for divine protection. And if certain people qualify, whoever they are, they will be preserved through the tribulation. And then at the seventh trump, all Christians, Moses, Abel, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all through the Middle Ages, all who are alive at that time will be caught up with the dead to meet Jesus. And then we'll be in the very throne room of God. He will apportion rulership at the sea of glass. Revelation 15:2 says it so clear. And then after the sea of glass, and we have been apportioned our rulership, we've received our reward. Revelation 19, this is the hope that we have. I'm going to start in verse 11 to close the message today. And I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse. And he that sat upon him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he does judge and make war. And in verse 13 tells who that person is. His name is the Word of God, capital W, the Logos, Jesus Christ. Then in verse 14, the armies which were in heaven followed him upon white horses, clothed in fine linen, white and clean. And who is this? It's going to be those who have been caught up to meet Jesus in the air, because look at verse 8 in the same chapter 19. Or let's go back to verse 7. Let us be glad and rejoice and give honor to him, for the marriage of the Lamb is come, and his wife has made herself ready. And to her was granted that she should be arrayed in fine linen, clean and white. Here's the definition of what it is. For the fine linen is the righteousness of the saints. So you and I are going to be on horses, white horses, following our captain of our salvation, Jesus Christ, to return to establish the kingdom of God on this earth. Godspeed that day.